Hello friends, you know that we try to study literature in the context of the life of the poet and also the age in which he lived. For that reason, reading history of English literature is important, and reading the history of English literature in the context of the political history, the cultural history, the social history of England is also equally important. Today I am going to talk about Henry VII. Henry VII, whom Francis Bacon, who wrote a historical account of the life of Henry VII, called him a wonder of wonders, a wonder for wise men. Why is Henry VII so significant in the history of England? Henry VII represents the beginning of the Renaissance, in a sense, and the end of the Middle Ages. In history, we try to put dates on certain events. Well, battles are fought in a certain year at a certain time. But the mindset does not change on one particular day in one particular year. Henry VII came almost at the end of what is known in English history as the War of the Roses. A funny title, isn't it? The War of the Roses was a series of wars during the reigns of three British kings. And these wars took place between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The House of York had the emblem of the white rose, and the House of Lancaster had the emblem of the red rose. And these wars were fought between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. In 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth, Henry, Earl of Richmond, son of Edward Tudor, defeated his rival Richard III, who was the reigning monarch, and Edward VII thus became the first Tudor king. A Venetian traveller had described England as a land of crime and theft. There is no country in the world where there are so many thieves and robbers as in England. That was what a Venetian traveller wrote about England in the late 15th century. When you have petty battles, then trade does not prosper. industry suffers and the economy of a country declines, when there is poverty, the able-bodied people have no other way to earn an income other than by crime, by theft, by robbery and crime. So you find, even in the novels of Daniel Defoe, descriptions of highway robbery. And they are graphically described in, for instance, a novel such as Roxana, for instance, or Captain Singleton, or Daniel Doranda, and others. So, Henry VII came almost at the end of the War of the Roses. I say almost at the end because a couple of years after him there was a pretender to the throne in one Robert Simnel. Robert Simnel got himself crowned in Dublin and declared himself the true monarch of England. However, at a battle at Stoke-on-Trent, Henry defeated him and appointed him as an assistant in the royal kitchen. So Henry VII did one major work in the history of England, and that was that he ended the Wars of the Roses. These are not to be confused. The Wars of the Roses are not to be confused with the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was fought between England and France in the 15th and 16th century. And this was because the English claimed control over the throne of France. The Wars of the Roses were a series of civil wars in England between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Henry VII was a shrewd king. Soon after his victory at Bosworth, he married Elizabeth, daughter of Edward IV, who was the heiress to the throne. And thus he united the two houses of Lancaster and York. Next, as I told you, he defeated a man called Lambert Simnel, who was a pretender to the throne. Thereafter, he defeated Perkin Warbeck, who was another pretender to the throne, and he defeated him in a battle in 1492. He went for marriage alliances. He married his daughter Margaret to James IV of Scotland, and thus, in retrospect, he united the two kingdoms of Scotland and England. You would remember that until the death of Elizabeth I, Scotland and England had separate kings. James I, the first of the Stuart kings, who ascended the throne of England in 1603 after the death of Elizabeth I, was the first Stuart king. He was son of Mary Stuart, a descendant of Margaret and James IV of Scotland. So Henry VII married off his daughter Margaret to James IV of Scotland, and he went for a marriage alliance for his son Arthur with Catherine of Aragon on the continent. And thus he tried to cement a friendly relationship between the continental powers, Spain and the Habsburg kingdom. However, Arthur died soon after his marriage, and then he married off Catherine of Aragon to his younger son Henry, who was actually being prepared for an office in the church. Henry VII made certain friendly alliances with a country such as Flanders on the continent, because England had a trade with the continent, especially in wool. And this alliance was called Intercursus Magnus. Intercursus Magnus. As I have told you, that the condition of English economy was very poor. Henry could not hope to call a parliament and get a fresh tax sanctioned by it. It is interesting to find that even as early as the 15th century, in fact it goes even farther back in British history, that no English monarch could tax the people without their consent. A fact which comes almost as a revelation to us in this country, because people did not have a say in the way in which they were going to be taxed until almost the middle of the 20th century in our country. Going back to Henry VII, he did not want to call a parliament for fresh taxes, and the economy of his country was poor. He tried to encourage trade and thus improve the economy of his country. But for trade to prosper, it was necessary that the social condition of England was good. The barons, it was one of the features of the Middle Ages that the barons were very powerful. You remember the Angevin king John, who signed the Magna Carta in the 14th century. In 1348, if my memory serves me right. And this was signed because of the powerful barons who made John sign the Magna Carta. Henry VII tried to curb the power of these barons, and for that he passed a statute of livery and maintenance. I would repeat, he passed a statute of livery and maintenance. By this statute, no English baron was supposed to have more than 300 men in his control. It was illegal. It was made illegal to have more than 300 men. This had a favorable effect on the economy because the barons used to force judicial verdict in their favor because of their men. And they, of course, use their men to exploit the people, almost to rob the people by force. When there was more order in the society, when there was more law, a better implementation of the law in the society, then the economy began to flourish. One of the master strokes of Henry VII's state policy was to have one John Morton as his Lord Chancellor. John Morton was a member of his Privy Council, which was called and which is known and remembered in history as the Court of Star Chamber. Court of Star Chamber. This is simply because the room in which the council met had beautiful metallic stars studded on the ceiling. So it was called the Court of Star Chamber. And Morton taxed the people not directly as a tax but as fines. So all these barons, unruly barons, were fined left, right and center. And that enriched the coffers of Henry. When Henry died in 1509, to remind you once again, he won the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, and when he died in 1509, England was a powerful country, much respected on the continent. But John Morton is remembered as for the term Morton's fork, because the people were always afraid of Morton's fines. Any break of law was not left unpunished, and rather than putting people into prison, Morton preferred to fine them, and that enriched the coffers of Henry VII. having taken care of Scotland through a marriage alliance and the continent with another marriage alliance with his son, he turned his attention towards Ireland. He sent Sir Edward Poynings to Ireland in 1495 and at Drogheda, Sir Edward Poynings called a parliament in which he declared that all the laws of England would have sway on Ireland as well. So with the help of Poynings, Sir Edward Poynings, Ireland was brought under the control of the King of England. Besides these, Henry followed a policy of encouraging seamen. You would remember that this was an age when European seafarers were going to different parts of the world. Amerigo Vespucci discovered America. Columbus landed at the West Indies Islands. That was in 1492. 5 years later, Vasco da Gama set sail from Lisbon and came to the shores of India. He landed at Kozhikode or Calicut in Kerala. That was in 1497. Why were these things happening? The immediate reasons were, in the first place, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. If you look at a map of Eastern Europe or Western Turkey, you would find a place called Istanbul. The ancient name of Istanbul was Byzantium. When Constantine the Great, in the 3rd century of the Christian era, accepted Christianity and made it a state religion, he shifted his capital to Byzantium and renamed it Constantinople. Constantinople fell in 1453, and the scholars who were at Constantinople or present-day Istanbul began to flee west. So the first wave of Renaissance was felt in a country such as Italy, which was prosperous. It was prosperous because of its Levant trade, because it was closer to India, and through the land route, Italian traders could come to India and even go to China. So these Italian traders made Italy the center of the world, as it were. So in the middle of the 15th century, when the Turks began to rule over Constantinople, then trade in Eastern Europe, in the Levant area, among the countries in the Mediterranean, began to decline. In the meantime, Europe learned about the art of making gunpowder. They learned this from the Chinese. And they also got the magnetic compass. These two things changed the history of Europe. The magnetic compass made it possible for seafarers to take their ships to the high seas, which made it possible for them to go to America. You would remember Sir Walter Raleigh, who was a seafarer, a sea pirate in fact, and who had been in the Tower for 13 years. And when James I had financial problems, Walter Raleigh was shrewd enough to suggest that he had heard about gold mines in South America and he could bring gold for him. However, he did not get that gold, but in the process he annoyed the Spaniards, and the Spanish king wanted punishment for Raleigh, and James I was too timid to annoy the Spanish king and had Raleigh executed. But let's go back to the late 15th and early 16th century. These two things, the compass and the gunpowder, changed the face of Europe. I have explained how the compass came in handy at a time when the Europeans were looking for new trade routes to India. It also unexpectedly made it possible for them to discover America. But the gunpowder made it possible for monarchies to rise in Europe. Before that, the monarchs were only minor powers. The chief ruler was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Voltaire in the 18th century made fun of the Holy Roman Empire and called it neither holy nor Roman nor empire. We would talk about the Holy Roman Empire on some other occasion. But today I may point out that the gunpowder made it possible for nation states to grow up, and Henry VII represents the beginning of the rise of nation states. With the rise of nation states, there was also a rise of the national languages. Henry More, who was a young man who came as a young man in John Morton's family, later became, that is after the death of Robert Wolsey, the Lord Chancellor of Henry VIII, almost as powerful as a Prime Minister. After his death, he became the most powerful person in Henry VIII's court. You would remember him, and he is remembered for his book called The Utopia. Utopia was actually written in Latin. No prestigious writer would write a book in the vernacular. About the same time, when the nation states were rising, the nation states rose partly because the monarch could have control over the gunpowder. When people could fight with bows and arrows, and in England with spikes, anybody could collect a group of people and attack another person, and he could also be a king. But with the control over gunpowder, it was the king who could not be easily defeated by his subjects, by his earls and barons. And when kings became powerful, then the languages of those nations also became powerful, began to rise. People began to write in those languages. So, with the rise of nation state, you have the rise of vernacular languages. Regarding books, about this time you had on the continent a man called Johann Gutenberg. He lived from 1398 to 1468. In 1442, he invented the printing machine. Soon thereafter, in London, a man called John Caxton, he set up a printing press in Westminster. And one of the books that he published was called La Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur was published in 1485. You would notice that the title of the book is La Morte d'Arthur, the death of Arthur. Arthur is the national hero, the folk hero of England, just as Rama and Krishna are folk heroes of India. So here you have the rise of early signs of the rise of the national languages. Henry VII is a seminal figure in British history because of his own policies and also because the times in which he lived. Europe was in ferment. The Renaissance was making its sweep over it. You don't find major signs of the Renaissance early in Henry VII's period. But the ground is being prepared. The soil is, as it were, being prepared for the plant of Renaissance to grow. When Henry's son, Henry VIII, ascended the throne in 1509, he became a major instrument of the Renaissance. Henry VIII was ostentatious, he was spendthrift, he was fond of good food and beautiful women. He married 6 times. Early in his career, he was a great supporter of the Pope, and Leo X conferred upon Henry VIII the title of the Defender of the Faith, because he had written in favor of Orthodox Christianity, the Orthodox Church, that was the Catholic Church, that was the Pope, and against the ideas of Luther. We would talk about Luther on another occasion, because Luther is another very great mind in Germany who influenced not only German literature but the whole of Europe. The Protestant movement was almost a product of the work of Luther. The preparations, of course, for the Protestant movement would go back to the 14th century. But that was, if it has to, all the credit has to be given to only one person, that would go to Luther. There were others, of course, like Erasmus, who wrote a famous book called In Praise of Folly. Holbein, the German painter, illustrated this book called In Praise of Folly. He came to England and he was a guest of Sir Thomas More, and he did massive paintings for Sir Thomas More. Holbein's painting of Henry VIII is also very famous, and one historian points out that this painting was so awesome that Henry's rivals or Henry's enemies felt small before this painting. So Holbein, the German painter, was in England and he painted many portraits. Some of the early ones were those of Sir Thomas More and his family. And later on he painted the portraits of Henry VIII. And today, if we have any account of Henry's appearance, it is owing to Holbein. So the currents, the waves of Renaissance began to make itself felt in England during the reign of Henry VIII. Henry VIII, as I pointed out, was loyal to the Pope. But when he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn and the Pope refused, and Wolsey could not get the permission of the Pope, then Henry got rid of Wolsey and declared himself a Protestant and separated his kingdom from the see of the Pope. And Henry himself became the head of the English Church, that is the Anglican Church. So this is how the revolt took place. Wolsey, his prime minister, came from a middle class family, and he also confiscated the church properties. All the smaller churches were removed. In the beginning it appeared to the Catholic Church that that was a favor done to them, because these small churches, the small parish churches, were taking away the revenue from the Pope. At the time of Wycliffe, and Wycliffe complains that the Rome was making more income from England than the throne, than the monarch. Wolsey, for a time it appeared, was helping Rome when he was dissolving the smaller churches and handing over the money for the establishment of new universities in Oxford. These new colleges that were appearing in Oxford after the dissolution of the churches in England became the centers for new learning. People like Colet and Lineker began to introduce Greek and Latin, and thus came humanism to England, which was leaving the medieval outlook, the medieval zeitgeist behind. During the early Tudors, Henry VII and Henry VIII, a new and modern England was being created. And it was no wonder that when Shakespeare and Fletcher jointly wrote the play Henry VIII, they were conscious of the fact that here was a man, here was a monarch who, in spite of all his shortcomings, his spendthrift habits, his concupiscence, he was creating or making way for a new England to rise from the ashes of the Middle Ages. Thank you.